Wait for it, and we're live. Hey, all you crazy sci-fi and fantasy fans. It's time for your daily dose of shenanigans over here at the Blasters and Blades podcast. Just a couple of nerdy veterans and one chaos coordinator geeking out over our science fiction passions and fantastical fantasies. A place where magic is king, the sky is the limit, and space is the place. We are the podcast that puts the fun in dysfunction. So without further ado, we're going to let our guest, Mr. Shane Gries, introduce himself to our listeners and viewers at home.
So, hi, I'm Shane. I just retired from the Army. I spent 35 years in uniform. I was 5 years in the Army National Guard enlisted and 30 years active duty as an infantry officer. I spent 18 years of those overseas, 3 years in Germany, 9 years in Korea, 1 year in Afghanistan, and 5 years working at the embassy in Australia. Started writing books about 5 years ago. A good friend of mine, Doug Burby, he started writing. He told me to get off my ass and start punching out novels. And my wife told me I needed a hobby. So between the two of them, I was sort of pushed into writing, which I did. And so I've been doing that. And I've got a couple short stories out and 7 published novels. And I'm working on the next one. Number 8 is in production right now.
Are all of them in the same universe?
No. So the short stories are obviously very separate things. They're their own entities. The first series I wrote, the first book I wrote, I intended it to be a trilogy. For all of you out there who have never written a book before, I highly recommend not writing a trilogy as your first endeavor into writing. That was a learning thing for me. But I love it. I love the series. It worked out well, but man, it was overly ambitious. The second project I worked on was with Canon Publishing in their Fallen Empire universe, Space Mercenaries. I love mercenaries. I think it's a cool idea. So that's a standalone. And then lately I've been writing zombie apocalypse books. And those have been, military oriented because that's what I write. And, it's focused on the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division, fighting in the Midwest against the zombie outbreak. And it's been great.
So did you write a trilogy, like numerically, or a Bane trilogy?
It's a trilogy. Like there's a beginning, middle, and end to the story.
So Banes are famous for their trilogies becoming 5 to 7 books. So that's where the joke of Bane trilogy comes from.
Yeah,
because
Project 3 books, beginning, middle, and end. Yeah, finished, all wrapped up in a bow.
Yeah. So what? Obviously, your military experience affects everything. You were in for a long time. Yeah. Do you feel like, other than the characters you write, being you're writing military themed stories, do you feel like it affects, like your military service affects the way you tell stories?
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. So, I've only been interested in reading 2 different genres my whole life, and that's military history and science fiction. And so all my writing, is based on my interests and my background, which is all military. So all my science fiction stuff is military or military adjacent. My zombie apocalypse stuff is all based around a military unit. So yeah, that is 100% influencing what I'm writing. Moreover, within those books, I draw upon personal experiences of myself and people I've known over the years. And those get, interwoven into the stories. And it just, some people have been immortalized and they don't even know it. You know what I mean? It's definitely something I draw upon from my own personal experience, and it influences everything I write.
Do you change the names when you immortalize those people, or do you sometimes actually use the name of the people with obviously their permission?
So yes and yes. So some people don't know they've been immortalized. They change their names. I file off the serial numbers pretty well with that. But yeah, ahead of time, I'll ask people, my old friends, hey, can I use you in a book? In my most recent book, I specifically did that with one of my oldest and dearest friends. And yeah, I used his name and, some of his real military experiences that he lived made it into the book. So yeah, I do a little bit of both, but if I use somebody's name, I ask them up front beforehand, to make sure everything's cool.
Because
I'd
the
hate,
aliens are a thing.
yeah, yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, I do a little bit of both. Sure.
Did you meet Sam Point? I'm pretty sure you did when you were in Australia.
Yes, I did.
So he's actually my advisor because I'm writing a series that has Australian military units. So I actually have him as a main character, and he feels like I insulted him because I made him an officer instead of a sergeant. But
Oh God, yeah. So Sam, so whenever I go around, I try to meet up with fans or people that are Facebook friends or interested in the same sorts of things as I am. And when I was in Australia as the Army attaché, I did a lot of traveling, a lot of official travel. So I was all over the country. And Sam lives in a place called Townsville. And
yes,
yeah, and if you're unfamiliar with Townsville, it's way up north in Queensland, up on the coast. There's a Australian Army Brigade headquartered there, and Sam's a retired, Australian Army NCO, as he pointed out, but he was Signal Corps. And Sam, he's a cool guy. I love him. We had dinner with him. My wife and I had dinner with him when we were up there. Just had a great time chatting with him. He knows everything there is to know about Townsville and the surrounding areas, and he's just active, and he's still plugged into that whole community. Just a really colorful character, and he's got French relatives, so he's always got this deep connection with France, and it's just an interesting and cool guy.
he was the one who told me that you've heard of the concept of sensitivity readers.
Mm-hmm.
He said he was the one who first told me that if I was going to write an Australian military unit, I need insensitivity readers. I need the opposite of that to make it authentic. And that's the funny thing about the Australians is they use the C word, like we use the F word. But if you use the C word in Amazon, it flags it as adult content. I'm trying to speak through the censors.
Oh,
and
sure.
so like it's a balance. Like on the one hand, I want to be authentic. On the other hand, it's like I also want to be able to publish this, and Americans can be prudish.
Oh, I know. So no, I because in a couple of my books I had British derivative, type characters with the accents and the colloquialisms and yeah, I use the C word many times in my books, and I had an editor, and she used to give me hell about it. She's like, "You can't use this word," and I'm like, "Well, I'm using it because that's how they talk. I don't care." So yeah, I know what you mean. It's interesting. It's funny when you're there because they think nothing of it.
Oh yeah. The funny thing is we did when I was doing the Galaxy's Edge podcast before they stopped doing it, just moment in time when they were first starting. We had another guy that was an Australian airman at the time. He's since gotten out, but when he thought we were done with the live stream, he's like, "Oh, you C words," and we were still live, and like YouTube was less than pleased at that little display of Australianisms. But it's weird when you talk to people with other nations' militaries that for all there are differences, there is a lot we have in common because a grunt is a grunt is a grunt.
Yeah, 100%. So, like I said, I was Army attaché at the embassy down there, and so we obviously the attaché community is very active. We're all military diplomats when you're attachés, and so we would frequently have dinners with each other, cocktail parties, whatever. And I felt like there was, and we were hanging out with people from Singapore, Cambodia, Japan, Korea, Papua New Guinea, and then of course Europe, the Swedes, the Germans, the French, the Brits, we had the Kiwis there, you name it. We had people from Timor-Leste, Vietnam, And one thing that becomes very clear right away is we all, as military people, had more in common with each other than maybe we did with some of our folks back home.
Yeah,
and it didn't matter what country you were from.
There's an old running cadence: if I die in a enemy, so something to the effect, if you die in a enemy combat zone, bury you with the enemy grunt, and it's kind of the point of the and it's been years, so I'm struggling to remember it, but that was the running theme of the whole cadence, was that you have more in common with the guys you're fighting than often you do with the people you're fighting for.
I think that might be true. I think there's a lot to be said for that.
Although I will say the Kiwis are a little bit nuts. We did some work with them when I was in Iraq, and we get to so there was no standardization in the Iraq military before we took over when it comes to like transportation stuff. So some of the loading docks are just randomly different shapes and different sizes, and you're trying to use them to offload cargo, because we were escorting convoys resupplying the new Iraqi National Guard or whatever they were calling it at the time. It went through a couple iterations for the name stuff. And there's this like 3-foot drop, and we're supposed to drive this Humvee off the back of this flatbed. And the Kiwi guy just gets up there, because we were facilitating him because his unit was in charge of training this unit of Iraqis. And he's like, "Oi, I got it." And then he jumps up. That's a horrible accent, but it's the best I got. Right, he just jumps in, not even looking, backs it out, floors it. And it just drops that 3 feet. And I'm like, I probably would have rolled that thing, but he just didn't care. He just gassed to the metal and rode it out and hope for the best.
I will tell you that the Kiwis, some of my closest friends were Kiwis. I think I got along with those guys so well. I don't know why. It just for me it clicked. I love those guys. Can't get enough of them.
I did learn that if you mix up the Kiwis and the Aussies, they get really mad at you. I did that a couple times.
What I did have a problem, my first year down there, I was actually an exchange officer for War College. So I was attending the Australian War College, with great experience, by the way. Super lucky I had the opportunity. But yeah, it took me about 9 months before I could distinguish between an Australian accent and a Kiwi accent, which they're like, "Mate, how can you not tell?" And so me and my Canadian classmate, they would always think, we spoke the same, which is not true, because the Canadian accent and then, my Michigan accent are different. And, and we could tell right away. And we're like, how can you not tell the difference between our accents? It's subtle, but it after a while you can tell.
Yeah. And some of the terms they use are just so different. I've written a couple of them down. I don't have them in front of me, just because like things you don't even think of, like a Kim light, like the little glow sticks that you shake and break and then it glows. Like they call them different things than us.
Oh yeah.
So I did
like for example, one of the things, the Aussies, they'll call a cooler, where you put your beer. Well, they'll call them an esky. Well, the Kiwis will call it a chili bin. So, you got to figure out who you're talking to to even decipher what we're talking about.
And the funny thing is if you go on some of these online sites that'll let you translate, and I've done that before, trying to get the dialogue right before. So I want it to be as good as possible before I send it to my Aussie friends to edit the dialogue so it has that je ne sais quoi, I guess, in honor of Sam and his Frenchy French. And he was like, this is like the Saturday Night Live version, like SNL version of what we sound like. We don't actually talk like this. With some of the slang, it was just so heavy. And I'm like, but it sounded authentic to the Americans.
Oh, geez. Yeah, some of it. They'll say they'll have some saying, and you'll just stand there slack-jawed like, I don't know what the words are coming out of your mouth.
What's that expression is two people united or kept apart by common language, something to that
effect. Yeah, something to that effect.
Yeah.
That's often very true. Yep.
One of the guys in my writing group is from Australia. So he's my go-to whenever I want to talk medieval stuff, because he does HEMA, historical European martial arts reenacting. Or not reenacting, but yeah. And so he's always, I'm like, wait, can you say that one more time in English for me? So we've talked about, like, obviously you draw on people from the military, some of them with their permission, some without. Do you think your military service affects the way you tell stories, or not the way you tell stories, the way you engage with stories as a consumer? So a watcher of the shows, a reader of the books?
Yeah. Um, absolutely. So, you always have to make a story interesting. So you have to make characters that are, interesting, and you have to make them distinguishable. And, as we have all known in the service, as with anything, you've got great people you're working with and not so great people you're working with. And so it's always hard for me to cast a service member in a negative light. So I struggle with that. But, I always write characters that I think are realistic. But there's things I can't do. Just me personally, I can't go overboard on some of the more dark stuff that is out there. There's people out there that are hyper racist, and I don't like to talk about shit like that. It's just I'm uncomfortable with it. But I try to be as realistic as I can with my characters. I don't do Mary Sue's with female soldiers. I make them realistic. Like some of them they're just like male soldiers. Some of them are terrible and some of them are awesome. And most of them are somewhere in between. And I try to, I don't want to portray any of my characters in an unrealistic light. But yeah, there's some subject matter that I just feel uncomfortable with that I won't write. And so, yeah, that affects how I tell stories a little bit, I guess.
So part of the thing is most people don't realize they think of the Army as a monolith, and they don't realize it's going to be different by branch. So by branch for us, that means your job. So the infantry is one thing, the cavalry is another, medical corps is another. Like all of those branches within this individual army have their own subcultures and their own sort of ways of doing things. And then you factor in the larger units that you might be assigned to, which also have their own subculture. Yep. And then all of that, if that didn't layer it complicated enough, the era you served in will matter. So a soldier's experience that served in the Cold War in the 80s versus the 90s versus the early aughts during the GWAT versus whatever came after, like those were all distinctly, it might as well have been a different service. Yeah. Because the experiences were so different. And I can compare it because I enlisted in 98. And so I got to see the post-Cold War, pre-9/11, and then the GWAT, Global War on Terror. And it was like one day we went, the Guard went camping, and the next day we're like, holy crap, we got to prepare for war, which we probably should have been doing all along. But you could just see the culture almost shift instantly. And then, of course, after the war in Iraq and Afghanistan wound down, it's back to, we won't fight every war in a desert. Maybe we should resume learning how to use our compass and, deal with camouflage and you could see those shifts.
Oh yeah.
So compacted because of the era we're living in that you imagine that's going to affect when you talk about like the racism. I don't imagine you'll see as much of it in the modern army as you might have in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s.
Well, it was, and that's a great point because I enlisted in 1989 and I just retired a couple months ago. So, almost 4 decades. And I remember when I first came in, you had TV shows like Tour of Duty on primetime, and the language and the subject matter and the content, even though they didn't use the F word, like the stuff they were putting on that show would never, ever be on primetime TV anymore these days. Like, no way. No way. And, the racist stuff they said, going to whorehouses and all that stuff. Like, I look at it and I'm kind of shocked, even though I lived it back in. That is subject matter that's taboo now, right? And,
absolutely.
And that was primetime television. And so, yeah, things have changed over the years a lot. We were, and when we were in the 90s, after Desert Storm, it was all peacekeeping operations. And, we thought, and the wall came down and we were like, well, what's the future of the military? Is this all we're going to do is stand around with blue UN helmets and, make people, make nice with each other? And, and it was all a very different time then. And then, and I remember volunteering to go to Korea at the end of the 90s because that's where the most action was. They were still doing division alerts and, there was still a bad guys up north of the DMZ. And, that's where I wanted to be because I was a young infantry guy and I wanted to get in the and the shit. And then 9/11 happened and the whole world turned upside down. And then everything changed. And it's been a wild ride. I gotta say.
Yeah, that's
a lot.
You'll get a kick out of this. When I enlisted in 98, CNN had just done a special. So I enlisted in September. I think it's September 9th. It's been a while. But the first week of September in 98, CNN did a special that world peace might finally be attainable. And I remember my recruiter telling my parents that, now I'm a military brat, so obviously we knew better, but I remember that with the straight face, the recruiter told my mom and dad that I didn't have to worry about as a guardsman going to war. I would be after the ladies auxiliary, but before the Boy Scouts would be my deployment order. And then of course, most of the GWAT was fought with the Guard and the reserves.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And you mentioned some of the stuff that happened in the olden days, if you will, of the military. Like I was a SHARP NCO, which for those that don't know is the sexual harassment and rape prevention NCO, where like they were so proactive in realizing this stuff isn't cool. Like we've evolved that they actually created whole positions to monitor that stuff. And I've heard people say, well, you protected the people doing the bad things, and they're missing the nuances because we knew if we let them go back to the barracks, they would get their head handed to them by the people that said, hey, that's not cool. And so it was protecting them so they could live to stand trial, not because we cared about their well-being.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of those things that people don't catch the nuance. They just say, oh, well, you brought them out of the barracks, so you must be shielding them. I'm like, no, I sat in on those trials. Like, no, there was no protecting there.
Well, and you probably remember back in the 90s when they had trainee abuse going on.
Oh, yeah.
Where drill sergeants were taking advantage of female trainees in basic training.
That was Fort Jackson had a huge problem with that back then.
Yeah, and you know that created all sorts of programs that fell out of that. And you know, I with age comes maturity and experience, and you know, years later, I became a battalion commander of a basic training unit, and you know. It really was important to me that we created a safe environment for America's youth, right? Like that was my responsibility. I was to establish a safe and challenging environment. You know, obviously the training had to be challenging and it had to be realistic, but I didn't want anybody's kids being preyed upon by predators in uniform. And, you know, while that is extraordinarily rare, it still exists, right? And we were very, very proactive about making sure that the trainees were protected, that they were safe from that.
Yeah.
They were still going to go out and throw live hand grenades and jump over obstacle courses and shoot live machine guns. But, you know, we weren't going to have them being preyed upon by people in positions of authority over them.
I remember, like, for all, I was in an era at the end of the era where drill sergeants could lay hands on you to convince you, to motivate you, so to speak. So, like, I remember the first time we went through the dry fire on the rifle range to zero our weapons, and I forgot to put mine on safe, and that was all they needed. They literally yeeted me out of the foxhole by my LBV suspenders and roughed me up a little bit to convince me of the error of my ways. And, you know, 20 years later, or however many years, I guess 20 years now, but like when I was in Iraq a decade later, I still like would freakishly check my dust cover to make sure it was closed and my weapon was on safe when I wanted it on safe because, you know, that hit home. But then the flip side of that is they challenged, like, our drill sergeants were going through when we were doing the bayonet course, because I don't know if they still do, but at the time we had to train on the bayonet.
I reestablished that when I was in command.
Nice.
It had gone out of vogue, and I brought it back.
And I remember when we were going to draw our weapons for it, the drill sergeant was going around with the pugil stick and hitting us, and you know, just having fun with it. I mean, it wasn't like he was hurting anybody. And I remember looking at him, I'm like, if you gave me one of those, I wouldn't go down so easy because I had pride and I was, you know, 18 and, you know, full of it. And he's like, he gives me the actual M16 with an actual live knife bayonet on there. And he goes, if you can hit me with that there pig sticker before I knock you out, I'll let everyone call home tonight. So I get set. I'm ready for this thing. And I guess I was waiting for like WWE style, like bell ringing. And the next thing I know, I'm on my ass looking at the light ahead. And he says, rule number 1 in war, no one tells you when it's time to go. You just do it. And so obviously we fast forward to the pugil sticks, which is basically, if you haven't seen it, dear listener, it's basically a stick with cotton ball type things, but it's hard rubber, I think.
It's like a big boxing glove at the end of a stick, except
Yeah, and you basically beat the crap out of your fellow trainees to practice your bayonet drill. I don't know how close it is to actually using a bayonet in combat. Mostly it's about learning to take a punch and take a hit and give one back and warrior spirit stuff, I think. But so he asked for volunteers to go against the drill sergeant, and I was still feisty. So I volunteered, and nobody had ever volunteered before. So they actually had to get the battalion commander to authorize to let me go against him and answer the challenge because they were so worried about the perception that they were like going over that line because of all of that. And I just remember the battalion commander just looked at me and he goes, "It's your funeral, Private," and that was that.
Good luck.
Yeah. I won and lost that one. You know, you do the back-to-back 10 steps, turn around, you go. Because of the first lesson, I went back-to-back, ran the 10 steps, turned around, ran back. And as he's turning around, I hit him in the face, gave him a bloody nose. I'm like running around like Rocky. I thought it was over. I just won the day, right? Give me my medal, send me home.
Oh, yeah, no,
and he taps me on the back of the shoulder with the pugil stick. And I turn around and he proceeded to hit my stomach to knock me over. And then he helped me stand back up. And the next thing I know, there was a sun and everyone got to call home and use all of that because I did draw blood while I was being treated by the medic with the smelling salts.
Oh my gosh. I only had one instance when I was in command of, at basic training where one of my cadre members physically, subdued a trainee, and they were on a rifle range, and the trainee had copped an attitude earlier in the day at breakfast. This trainee had gotten the attention of a drill sergeant. Well, they get out to the rifle range and one drill sergeant tells her drill sergeant, "Hey, that one was causing trouble in line at the chow hall early in the morning." And drill sergeant confronted her and she decides she's got a rifle in her hands at the rifle range. Now she doesn't have any live ammunition, but the drill sergeant's getting in her face. And so she butt strokes him in the chest.
Ooh, bad decision.
She's like 5'4", and the drill sergeant's like 6 foot tall, but he's like 250 pounds of muscle. He looks like a WWE wrestler, right? And he literally grabs her and lifts her over his head and body slams her into the dirt. And that was the first lesson she learned about.
in the infantry, we call those poor life decisions.
Yeah. I ended up giving her a field grade Article 15, 45 to 45. So
I mean, I got in some trouble, but never that bad. I will say that those lessons that you learn, if done right, like they'll save your life later. I think making basic training softer is not helping anybody in the long run.
No.
And the proudest moment I had is I remember I grew 3 inches at boot camp. So supply hated me. And then I lost so much weight at graduation. My mom didn't recognize me. She literally just started looking for white dudes with glasses in the right platoon and narrowed it down from there. Well,
it was 10 weeks of training when I was in command. I don't know how long basic is anymore. They keep changing the length of it, but we wouldn't start sizing them and fitting them for their dress uniforms until week 6 of basic training because they would lose so much weight.
Yeah, this was mostly the because I grew in height, my BDUs and my boots didn't fit, so that's what I had to keep getting fit. But I learned because by the time I'm on my 3rd pair of boots with blisters, because I have to keep breaking in new boots, the drill sergeants felt sorry for me, so they showed me the shower trick where you just wear them in the shower and then let them dry on your feet, and then you take them out and you get the moisture out from there, and then you've essentially molded them. That doesn't work with modern boots, but I don't really think you have to break those in like you did the old ones.
I think when I went through, it was just wear them. One thing is going to give your feet or the boots.
Yeah, but most people don't have to change boots to brand new ones that often, so they kind of felt sorry for me. But that was my proudest moment because I actually failed my last PT test at boot camp. I missed the run by 3 seconds. But because I had lost so much weight and made so much progress, they gave me, you get the one retest right before they make you road guard for your own graduation. And my drill sergeant ran behind me with a rubber ducky. And every time I slowed down, I got a butt stroke to the kidney. So I passed it with 15 seconds to spare. And they were so impressed. All of my drill sergeants bought me a K-bar as my graduation present, which I still have.
Those guys are great Americans. They
were. And I ran into them in Iraq when their unit was relieving ours. And I actually recognized him, and he did not recognize me. So I was able to, and I was a sergeant by then. So that was a fun experience.
Oh my
So
gosh.
did you ever run into any of the guys when you were leading the basic training battalion that you ran into when you forward deployed?
Oh, so I commanded after I deployed.
Oh, okay. That made it difficult.
Yeah, and I never ran into any of my trainees because after I left battalion command, I was always on like senior level staffs and things like that where you didn't interact with lower enlisted anymore. Not really. I mean, when I was, the deputy chief of staff at 8th Army in Korea, I was in an office with colonels and generals, so.
Did you, do you remember the EAS song that was popular by that Marine? What was it? Taylor J. Satfield did the EAS song that was so famous.
No, I'm not familiar with it.
All right. Well, one of the things about it was he was commandant of the Marine Corps at the time was a lot less than pleased with that song. And one of the lines in there that always resonated is, "I'd rather run over another IED than ever have the PC speak to me." Because when you're a lower enlist, that's the last thing you want to do is talk to the brass. Like if you're talking above company level, you done effed up.
Well, here's a funny story. Since we're telling stories, so I was commanding the basic training battalion, and like I said, I had been in Afghanistan years before that, and so I'm out doing what I did every morning. I was out observing training, and so I decided to go visit Charlie Company one morning, and they were out on the hand grenade range. And before they go out and throw live frags, they're going through the obstacle or the grenade assault course where they're going from station to station, throwing grenades in trenches and then through windows and in bunkers, and they're in buddy teams and they're going from station to station and throwing practice grenades. So I'm talking to the company commander and we're just standing there next to the trail. And so these trainees are running by, of course, everybody runs everywhere, right? So when you finish this station, you move to the next, you move out at double time. So the trainees are coming by, and it's like week 3 of basic. So the trainees do not have any idea how to deal with an officer. They've been told to salute them, but they don't know how. And, as a battalion commander, I never shouted or yelled at a trainee. Drill sergeants can, that's what they do. But I know they're scareder than hell talking to an officer. So I always spoke calmly to them. If I was correcting them, I would just correct them and have them move on. If the drill sergeant wanted to jump in and scream at them afterwards, whatever. That's fine. But I would never do that. That's not my role. I'm not a drill sergeant, but I will make on-the-spot corrections, and I will do it calmly and whatnot. So these 2 trainees come running on a trail, and they see 2 officers standing there, and they stop. They come to attention, and they have a salute. And one of them's got a salute like this, and the other, And so I'm like, okay, privates, hold on. And I go, all right, hey, change your hand and cock it like this, and blah, blah, blah. And so I'm making this correction on this private, and I'm looking at him, I'm like, holy shit, it's my interpreter from Afghanistan. I go, Mikey, is that you? And he's like, yes, sir. I could have fainted on the spot. I couldn't believe it. This is the guy that stood next to me for an entire year in Afghanistan as an Afghan national, as my interpreter. And here he was in my basic training battalion and on my hand grenade range. And I'm like adjusting his salute. I couldn't believe it. And Mikey wasn't his real name, obviously. That was the nickname. And he liked being called Mikey because, he didn't want the locals knowing what his family name was because there might have been retributions and things towards his family. So, and then, of course, everybody's seeing my shocked, response to this person. And so one of my company commanders standing there going, sir, is everything okay? And I got drill sergeants seeing something's weird, and they're sprinting like full on coming over. Sir, what did this trainee do? Is everything okay? We get to sort out. And I'm like, this guy was my interpreter in Afghanistan. This guy, like, I was in combat with this guy. And like, all of a sudden, everybody else was jaws are dropping and hitting the floor. And of course, the trainee, the battle buddy of his, she had no idea. She was like, looked like she was going to pee her pants on the spot. Like, what is going on? But yeah, Mikey was in my basic training battalion, and every now and again, I check in on him and talk to him and ask him how he's doing. and he did great. I knew he would do great. I mean, the basic training wasn't nothing for a guy like that. I heard stories about him in firefights before I got there, and you know the time I had with him, he was rock solid. Like just anyway, it's a small world, and you really have some interesting experiences.
Some of those interpreters were more patriotic Americans than some of the Americans I know. So
he's an American NCO now.
Good for him. Yeah, it was. I don't know. Like I said, I have nothing but respect for the locals we had to deal with. We didn't deal with interpreters much, mostly because we were doing like convoy escorts, so we were fob jumping. So you know, we didn't normally need interpreters. Yeah. But obviously, as a grunt, I know people who had more traditional infantry missions that dealt with them, and hands down, there nothing but good things to say about them.
Yeah, I had a lot of them because, like I said, I was transition team chief. We were living with the Afghan National Security Forces, and we were out with them all the time. So yeah, we needed them.
So obviously, because we got talking, I forgot to ask you the religion question. So before we air this beautiful commercial and then get to talking about your books, I do have to ask you the religion question. But are you ready for this, sir?
I am ready.
All right. Star Wars, Star Trek, or Firefly?
Okay. So Star Wars with a caveat. Episodes 4, 5, 6, and Rogue One, and The Mandalorian. Everything else is shit. I'll die on that hill.
Go ahead.
And I'm a big brown coat fan. So sad it only made one season and one movie, but I hope they do some more.
The Rogue One. Are you familiar with the Angry Staff Officer podcast that then became War Stories podcast? It's a military history podcast now, but they used to do when they were the Angry Staff Officer. And as you can imagine, they were staff officers and angry, so they made a podcast and named it such. But they did a breakdown of like some of the battles in Game of Thrones. They did a breakdown of some of the Sharps Rifles TV series that Sean, what was his last name? Sean Bean, yeah, that he did. They did one on Rogue One, and they broke it down on everything wrong with the logistical train and why Rogue One was destined to fail from the beginning because of piss poor logistics, why the Game of Thrones never would have happened because they couldn't have supported the law. I mean, they broke down all that shit. It was glorious, and I'm like, this is the old adage of professionals, or so was it amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics, I think is the old adage.
Remind me to talk about that when we get to my books. But so I am familiar with Angry Staff Officer. I am not familiar with this particular piece that you're talking about. But yeah, that sounds about right.
It's an interesting thing. In fact, one of the when you're in the guard, sometimes you do weird weekend assignments just because they need bodies for like a guard duty or something. And so I remember getting to sit in because I was a college student. I was a grad student. They're like, well, you could sit in on this class at the Naval War College. And they had what they called the MEU problem. The 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force gets sent back to ancient Rome with all of their equipment, whatever their basic combat load is. And they've got to face off against the Roman Legion, who wins. And your gut rings, of course we win. We've got bullets. And then somebody breaks it down and it's like, even if you believe one shot, one kill for every rifleman, and even if some of those rounds do double duty and go through and kill 2 people, they've got more bodies than you've got bullets. And at the end of the day, once you run out of bullets, your target practice for the Romans that are used to bleeding.
Yeah, so I can't wait now. I have to talk about it. So that's the core. That is the core problem in my zombie apocalypse books. It's a recurring theme throughout them. It's logistics. Like my friend Doug Burby and I have had this talk about.
I know him. He's a good guy.
Yeah. So me and Doug have been talking about this. So Doug retired as a lieutenant colonel. He was a career logistician, and I was an infantry guy. Oh, by the way, we were also roommates in college, so we've been partying together for 30 years. Okay. 30. But Doug and I had this conversation years ago about, hey, in the zombie apocalypse, how would we, I said, well, Bradley fighting vehicles would be the best thing. And Doug's like, no way, the logistics, you can't get spare parts and ammo, and, you'd be out of fuel and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, yeah, bullshit, we'll just grunt. So anyway, that is now part of my zombie books. And it's all anchored in logistics. It's all true. Like if we had unlimited industrial base and ammunition and fuels and parts and food and all that stuff, the zombie apocalypse would be a non-starter because, grunts would just be room clearing all day and it'd be the most boring shit ever. But the problem is when the industrial capacity of the U.S. collapses and the rail lines aren't running anymore and you can't run convoys on the highways and you can't move food, fuel, and ammunition and spare parts, and airplanes and aircraft and helicopters break down and airfields are in disrepair and all this shit, soldiers can't fight. And that
you go primitive real quick.
It becomes a problem. It becomes a problem real fast. And it turns out it turns into a problem real fast. So yeah.
So they have the logistics just from the civilian side. We learned this, if you didn't already know, during COVID, but most grocery stores, they're out of food in 3 days.
Mm.
Most canned goods that people think I've got canned goods, I'm okay. Those expire in 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
The tin is a stretch. You got to check them before you eat it. MREs have a 5 to 10 year shelf life. Civilian MREs, generally you can get 25, but how many people actually have those? Gas goes bad after, I think, 1.5 years, 2 years. If you want to really see, yeah, there's a documentary called Life After Humans. And if it's the premise is humans just, somebody snaps, humans are all gone. What happens to the planet? And it breaks down pretty quickly how, without proper maintenance, how quickly nature reclaims. And that includes suddenly the roads are no more because plants are growing under them, through them, and then breaking up.
Yep.
So it's a fascinating thing to think about. And they forget this on if you've seen The Walking Dead, I presume.
Yep.
That was one of the things they never really addressed. I mean, the zombie apocalypse has been going on for years and they're going into towns and they're still finding canned goods. I'm like, well, first off, probably would have been rated by now. And if it wasn't rated by now, it's not edible.
Yeah. And like you said, how long does gasoline work? I mean, I keep watching that show and they're running around in cars and motorcycles and all kinds of shit. It's like, okay, that's not happening after a certain point. And gasoline gets degraded depending on how hot it gets outside. So in the southern states, your gas is going to be, no good in 3 to 6 months. Maybe it'll last a little longer, but
and then high performance vehicles, they need a different kind of gas. You're not talking about the 87, 89, or 94 grade gas. You're talking like JP8, jet propulsion fuel, which is, I don't know the difference. I'm not a mechanic, but it is significantly different. You couldn't just run regular gas off these machines.
Yeah. And you got in The Walking Dead, they're going through years of this stuff and they're still carrying around guns and shooting people. And I'm like, the ammo is going to be gone pretty fast. So
and that's one of the things most people don't realize is if the Connecticut Yankee Calculus Court, we're okay. I know tech. Well, you know how to use tech, but do you know how the functions? Do you know the science behind a combustion engine? Mm-hmm. I don't. I can drive a car. Could I build one? No. Right. And so that's the idea is people think, well, I know how to do this. Okay, but do you know how to build it?
Right.
I know in theory I could fire a black powder rifle. I've entered black powder rifle competitions, but damned if I know how to make the black powder.
Right. Exactly.
And so, because in theory, you could go back to flintlocks and be able to live off the land.
Yeah.
If you knew
the electrical grid back up.
Yeah.
I like flicking my light switch and turning the lights on, but I couldn't get the electrical grid back up online if it was knocked out. I wouldn't know the first thing about it.
And then there's the sci-fi theory that comes up if like an EMP wipes everything out, could we get to the point where we are now and go past it? And most people think no. And the reason for that is that most of the fuel resources that are easy to get, we've already grabbed. So we would need the modern tech to go deeper to get what's left. Now, there is some argument that nature heals and some of those, fossil fuels or whatever would replenish. I don't know that we've got a scientific answer, but it's not as easy as people think either.
No, I don't think so.
So it's an interesting problem to think about when you start talking post-apocalyptic and sci-fi.
Yeah.
And zombies, definitely a little bit of both.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I love that whole, apocalyptic thing. How are you going to make it? When the grocery stores no longer have food, what are you going to do?
And I actually
people are like, well, I'll just plant a garden. Oh, really? When's the last time you grew food? And
I've been trying to get my victory garden to go for the last 7 years, and I have yet to get a successful crop.
Right.
I keep trying though. Mostly because it's relaxing to try, even if I fail.
And let's just say, oh, you did figure out how to grow food. Yeah. How do you preserve it over the winter so you can make it till the next season when everything is ready for harvest again?
Yeah.
That's the thing.
And then the other part is we've got population density that without modern tech and modern farming and modern logistics, you just can't support.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the running thing is the worst place you want to be on a zombie apocalypse or any apocalypse is Hawaii because the islands just can't support that many people.
You're dead. You're dead.
Mass starvation.
My zombie books too, Hawaii. Yeah,
nice. All right, so I want to get to your book. So let's finish these religion questions. We'll air that beautiful commercial, and then we'll jump right in because I'm having too much fun. Yeah. All right, because we are polytheistic here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, Game of Thrones, The Wheel of Time, or Chronicles of Narnia?
Well, the televised HBO Game of Thrones. I haven't read the books, but I did watch it on HBO. I love it.
Did you like the ending?
No.
Okay. It's I haven't invested in it because I generally, as a rule, if it comes out in book first, I want to read it before I watch it and vice versa. Sometimes the movie was first and I'll watch the movie before I read the adaptation. But if I know I'm not going to get an ending, I'm just not going to torture myself. So I won't start it. And Sanderson has already said Brandon Sanderson won't finish the series for George when he dies. So,
yeah. I mean, it starts off well. It's like a bunch of my favorite authors who start these series and never end them. Still like the series, even though I really wish there was a good ending. So that's kind of how I look at it. But it goes back to your, discussion earlier about tactics and things. Game of Thrones hoses that up all day long. They really need some good military advisors, even in these fantasy battles. Just a bunch of people running at each other with swords and axes and shit. That's dumb. We've always had tactics, and I'm sure in a fantasy world, even with magic systems and everything else, there would be tactics and not just a bunch of like thousands of dudes and orcs and whatnot running at each other, hacking each other.
Even Neanderthals that were hunting down woolly mammoths used tactics to attack the big animals.
Of course they did.
And so it's one of those things where, and the other thing is we've glamorized the sword so much just because cool factor, and I won't begrudge them that, but realistically, most people have pikes.
Right.
And then your offensive weapon for range is going to be a bow of some sort, probably on par with the English longbow or the shorter version like the French used.
Yeah.
But
the opening scene of Gladiator, right? When the Legion is, using catapults, so they're starting with indirect fire, and then you can see them using signal flags, and then, the bowmen and the infantry get ready, and then they get the cavalry to go around on a flank. I've heard people say, well, nobody does cavalry assaults through the woods. Okay, got it, whatever. But at least this movie attempted to use tactics instead of just dudes running at each other with swords,
Historically speaking, this is my history nerd coming out, it's not considered good form to make a cav charge in the woods, but you fight the war you're given, and sometimes you've just got to do, a bad decision is better than no decision. And if the only way to flank them is on horse, then you do what you got to do.
Well said. Well said.
I mean, look at perfect example of sometimes battles just sort of happen. In fact, when I write, I actually take that into account. When it gets to the battle scene, my outline just says insert battle here. And then I start designing my tactics based on where everyone is when I get to the point where, hey, it's time for the battle, because that's more realistic. The idea that you can plan the perfect battle, it gets boring if every combat scene in your book is Thermopylae or the Alamo or what Battle of the Bulge. Like sometimes it's a shitstorm and you just got to roll with the sandwich you were given.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, totally agree.
I get the point, like perfect strategy, you wouldn't send your horses through the woods, but I actually thought they did a pretty good job, factoring in. I know the Eagle. Have you seen that one?
Yes.
That gets. Like that too. I did. It gets bad form because that's not how the Romans would have used it. But not being an expert on Roman tactics, just looking at it, I mean it made sense for the tactical situation, even if it's not historically accurate.
Yeah.
So I appreciated that they made the effort.
Yeah. And when they do make the effort, I appreciate it. But gosh, some movies don't even bother. And it's like, oh, come on, guys. Can we at least try a little bit? And that applies to sci-fi too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. And one of the crying shames of adulthood is people no longer ask us this question. So thanks to one of our patrons, we are bringing this back, sir. So what is your favorite dinosaur?
Oh, Velociraptor. And if you've watched Step Brothers, you'll know the reference.
It's an excellent movie. You got an excellent choice. Excellent taste.
Are we best friends now?
We are.
Good. Let's go to the fort. Let's do karate in the garage.
Yeah, that was one of the memes that you see all the time when you see, like, and the joke is the 0311 and the 11 Bravos meet somewhere. Did we just become best friends? Yep. The infantry and the Marines and the infantry and the Army. We have different tactics, but there is some similarity, I think. I should say it was different when I was in. Obviously, a lot of stuff has changed since I got out, so who knows what they're doing now. All right.
Heavens knows.
Yeah, for all I know,
it's probably very similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, for all I know, they're sitting around playing tiddlywinks. I don't know. It's the new age, man. What are you going to do? All right, because we are civilized human beings here at the Blasters and Blades podcast, we are no longer knuckle-dragging troglodytes. Coffee or tea, and how do you take it?
Coffee, black. That's just how I roll. Got to cut down on the carbs.
Yeah. Do you still drink it like brewed, or can you stomach the MRE instant style? I can't do instant.
Usually it's brewed. But if I gotta, do the instant stuff, you got to do what you got to do, right?
So the Army had a policy when I was in Iraq about the amount of rest time you're supposed to have per day. And it's supposed to give you 8 hours to rest before they send you back out on combat patrol, unless obviously shit hits the fan. Okay. But they figured out a way to break that up. So we do 10 hours on the road, 4 hours off, 10 hours on the road, 4 hours off. And that was my rotation for months. But as you know, when you're in charge, your off time isn't off. So you got about an hour as soon as you clear, because you got to get everything prepped, resupply, feed your guys. Then you got to go to the meetings while they're sleeping. You get 2 hours of sleep and you wake up, and then you got another hour of meetings, briefings, security updates, all the things. So I would do 12 on, 2 off, 12 on, 2 off nonstop. So you learned that caffeine was your friend. So we would take the instant coffee from the MRE, you'd put it under your gums like dip, and it would get the caffeine straight to your bloodstream. And I lived that way, but now I can't look at instant coffee the same way. And I'm like, nope, I got to brew it myself. I can't do it.
Yeah. No, when we were in Ranger school, you're sucking it up because you're like, well, got to do this for a couple of months, but that's pretty realistic training for real combat operations. Very little sleep, very little food. Leaders get less sleep, less rest than anybody else. That's reality.
The people ask me, what's my scariest experience in Iraq was, and I know they expect some, this firefighter, that one, and there were certainly some hairy moments, but I always come back to the time because we were so overworked. I remember sitting in the TC seat as we're the rear convoy or the rear gun truck in the convoy, because they moved me around as the security commander so I could observe the whole thing. And I remember waking up in the TC seat when I was on patrol. I should have been awake for, and I look over and I realize my gunner's asleep and my driver's asleep, and somehow we're driving down the road because we were so freaking exhausted. And I'm like, holy shit. And that's when I learned the fine line, the fine skill of deadlining a vehicle. So we would get to a base where we liked the facilities, and suddenly everything just broke, and the mechanic could never figure it out, and we would take some short vacations.
Yeah. I mean, that's survival right there.
Yeah. It's one of those things that you put some of that in your books, though, and people are like, oh, that's not realistic. I'm like, well, let me tell you about that time. And I've learned to accept that sometimes, like, what happens in the real world, if you wrote it in a book, people are going to just hit the no, I don't believe you button. And I give you an example. I'm sure you've been following the Iraq or the Ukraine-Russia stuff.
Yeah.
So drones have become very big, and Russia has gotten into the drone game to drop grenades and stuff on, much like the Ukrainians were doing to them. Yep. And so the Ukrainians said, well, we'll take their drones out with our drones. And they literally put sticks on their drones, and they were jousting the Russian drones out of the sky. with sticks.
Awesome.
Like primitive, which I think is, the irony of all of that is just top notch. And I don't even care which side was using the sticks. But if we wrote that in a book, people are like, no way anyone would do that. And then you just give them the true stories.
And, it harkens back to World War I, where the first airplanes were used for reconnaissance. And pilots started taking handguns up there and started shooting at each other.
And dropping grenades.
Right. And then it just evolved. Now there's machine guns. Now there's bombs. And, 25 years later, there's Stukas and, P-40 Tomahawks. And, I can only imagine where drone technology is going and how fast it'll go.
Yeah, I had this discussion with Denote. Chris Denote is a sci-fi writer and retiring Air Force officer.
I know him. Good guy.
He is. I've co-written with his wife for some stuff, but about how they're going to do, because obviously the tradition of the ace combat pilot.
Chris and Jamie are awesome. They're both awesome.
Yeah, and the idea is, well, like what makes an ace? Because in theory, you take out 5 enemy as a fighter pilot, you're an ace. But does the drones count right now? No. We would joke on the convoy escorts that if they counted taking out V-beds, we were aces 3 or 4 times over. And so they're going to have to reinvent how we measure success in combat now that you're factoring in the unmanned stuff. And I honestly don't know which way they're going to go.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting discussion.
It's like that old, if you've seen some of the World War II bomber movies, Masters of the Air, I think Apple TV did, is a good one. And you see like they've got the number of bombs they dropped or the targets they hit, and then a random cow painted on there because, the bomb went south or whatever and accidentally destroyed a cattle farm or whatever. Like, oops. And you have to imagine at some point they're going to have to start counting drones and all of that. So
yeah, it's going to be interesting where that goes.
But now you appreciate that thing they taught us in history class, may you live in interesting times, and why that's a curse.
Yeah, that's where we're at.
We're in the interesting times. Can give me some boring. But now I want to talk about your zombie book. So we're going to pause for a moment while we shamelessly show for the man. And when we get back, we are going to hit it hard on the thin, dead line.
Awesome.
So footage.
The government underestimated the outbreak. The best medicines couldn't stop it. Now, the dead are walking the streets, and they're hungry. Zombie Patient Zero is 9 tales of flesh-ripping, brain-splattering mayhem from Bayonet Books, the boldest name in action and horror anthologies. From deep space to luxury resorts, nowhere is safe. Zip up your hazmat suit and dare to find out how it all went wrong. Zombie Patient Zero, from the deranged minds that brought you Contact This and Storming Area 51. Pick up your copy today in paperback or Kindle.
All right, thank you for sticking us through that commercial interlude, and I still love that logo. One of the things I started writing, they're like, "Don't name your imprint after yourself; it'll seem like unprofessional. Pick something else." And I'm like, "Well, I was in the infantry, Spirit of the Bayonet. Why not? Bayonet Books?" And it stuck.
Yeah, I love it.
I'm just glad I got it.
By the way,
that
looks really great.
Michael Gallagher, I think, was the one who made that for me. I'd have to check. Mostly I talked to him on Discord. I knew his Discord handle, but yeah, he could actually narrate some of that the spooky stuff. He's got the voice for it. He's like, if I ever stop writing my own books, I'll get to that.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah, he did a good job on that one. So speaking of zombies, obviously before we start talking about this series, we have to talk about content warning labels, whatever. So what would the age range of the Thin Dead Line series be for parents that are listening? Can my kids?
I guess it's rated R. I guess so. There's a lot of F words and there's a lot of graphic violence.
So is it mostly the violence and the gore, or is there like bedroom activity?
No, I don't have a lot of sex in my books. Very little, but a lot of violence, a lot of language. Not the C word, but the F word is.
Okay. All right, well, we're going to show that cover real quick because I like it so much. So this is obviously the book 1 cover. Who did the art? Because most of the time you see a lot of the AI stuff, and to see you go kind of retro with the art style, I really dig it.
Oh gosh. So I don't know the guy's name. My publisher, JF Holmes, he hired this guy from the Philippines who's done all of my covers for this series and all the covers for the Fallen Empire series. He's got a really cool style.
I dig it.
Yeah, no, it's really neat. And if you see the covers of my other books,
we're going to go to them next because I had some questions about this one.
Oh yeah, they're so well done, I think.
Obviously, if you look at the top, and I'm going to zoom in if you're watching, if you look at the top, you obviously see fighters firing weapons, destroying cities. So do you have combined arms in this universe?
Oh God, yes. Oh God, yes. There's full up combined arms, joint even operations in the cities. All, you know, Army and Air Force specifically. Obviously, there's not a lot of Navy involved in the Kansas City fight. But yeah, we bring it all together: artillery, mortars, infantry, armor, attack aviation, A-10, support aircraft, all that stuff. I've got JTACs in there, Air Force, TACPs. If you're not familiar with that, they're Air Force folks that call in airstrikes that work with the Army. I have it all in there, because if you're going to have a modern Army fighting, this is how they operate. And the enemy just happens to be zombies. That's the big.
Is that a Bradley or a Stryker? It's hard to tell on the image just because it blurs out when you zoom in. If that's
totally a Bradley fighting vehicle. So the hero vehicle in my series is named Bohica. So every armored vehicle, well, almost every armored vehicle, depends on the unit, has a name. And the naming convention is usually if you're in A company or Alpha company, all the names start with an A. If you're in B company or Bravo company, all names start with a B. So our infantry company is Bravo company, and their vehicle, their Bradley, is named Bohica, which is an acronym. And would you care to tell the audience what that acronym stands for?
Bend over, here it comes again.
That's it. So Bohica is their Bradley, and it plays prominently in the series. But the reader will have to go out and see. It's fun.
When is this series set, like on a chronological standpoint?
So it's sort of like an alternate history. It starts in the year 2016. So like 8 years ago. So this is based in JF Holmes's Irregular Scout Team universe. So he wrote this whole series years and years ago, and he asked me to do a companion novel, which I turned into a series because it was successful. And his outbreak started in 2016. He wrote the original books in like 2010 or 2012 or whatever.
So Strikers were already out. So is there a reason you went Bradley instead of Stryker?
Yeah, because I spent most of my time on Bradleys in my career. So I have a soft spot for them.
That's a good enough reason. I finished my career as a Stryker brigade after having been light infantry. Ooh. So I don't know. I have a soft spot for them, but I also never had to take them to a war zone. My mount, as you were, was a Humvee.
Yeah.
When I was in Iraq with the Haji armor, which is what we called it at the time. I don't know. Hillbilly armor, I guess, is the more politically correct expression.
Yeah.
So
I spent a good chunk of my career on Bradleys in Korea, and I have a soft spot in my heart, always will, for the Bradley fighting vehicle.
But given the degradation of the roads, there could be a good argument that the tracked vehicle might be better than a wheeled vehicle.
Well, for off-road, 100% yes. So there's nothing better off-road than a tracked vehicle.
I mean, you can take this off-road.
Are superior. But yeah, you don't want to stay on the road when you're fighting, though.
No, not at all. So this is the second image we got up. Dead Storm Rising is book 2, because we're talking more holistically about the series, because as we're recording this, the third book just came out.
Yep.
But obviously, if you haven't read book 1 and 2, the third book doesn't matter to you. So we're talking about the whole series. But while we've got him here, we're going to show the cover. So who is the girl on the front of the second cover? Dead Storm Rising.
That's Specialist Gray. She's part of the rifle squad that's surviving through books 1 and 2. I'm not going to do any spoiler alerts. I don't know. I'm not going to say if she survives any further.
So in this universe, women are already in the infantry in 2016?
Yeah, because women were admitted in the infantry, I think, in 2014.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know it was that far back. Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember which year it was. I did do a little research to make sure I got the timelines right. But yeah, women are in the infantry at this point in real life. And so they are in my books as well. So Gray is one of the members of the rifle squad. And but she's just one. She's just one of the characters. There's a bunch of them. They're really colorful.
You'll get a kick out of this then. The first female NCO in the Marines that went into the infantry ended up getting removed from her position because she was having an affair with a junior NCO in her command. She was a sergeant. He was a lance corporal. You know, obviously they frown on that kind of stuff, so they removed her. And I'm like, wait a minute. She got in trouble because she couldn't keep her zipper up? Hell yeah, she actually was one of us. Yeah. I'm like, okay, I'm sold.
So I do touch on those themes in the books, so that is not off limits. So there are some discussions in there. You'll have to read the book. But,
so do you, like, that's one of the things is obviously in modern warfare, like the restrictions aren't the same. Do you, because you've got people right as the conversion is happening, do they just ignore it because they got bigger fish to fry? Or does some of the guys come up with, like we would have seen at the time the transition happened, like, oh, there's no way they're actually good enough? Like, do you address that?
Yes. Yeah. I talk about a lot of that. I talk about the zipper problems. I talk about, so I try to, like I said, I don't do the Mary Sue thing, right? I don't have these women that are super women that they're without flaws and can do everything better than anybody else. They're women exactly like I've known every woman in my life, you know, and like some are super awesome, amazing people, and some are just terrible, just like men. And we've all known them while we've served. We've seen women in uniform that are just an inspiration. And then we've seen some that are just, you know, terrible, just like we've seen with men. So, yeah. And I try to reflect that evenly and as accurately and as believably as I can in the books. So Gray comes to the company, and there's a story in there. Gray comes to the company with another female. They're the first 2 female infantrymen in the company, and the other female decides to go sleep with the first sergeant.
Ooh.
Right. And then things happen. But Gray, she is like, I want to be respected on my merits. I want to be respected as a soldier. So all these, but the male soldiers in the company are drawn to her like flies because she's the only female, and there's sexual advances coming from every direction. And she's like belligerently pushing all that off because she doesn't want to be seen as something like that. So that's the character Gray is. Excuse me. She is belligerently, you know, fending off all these advances because she wants to be respected on her merits as a soldier, while her battle buddy immediately got kicked out of the company for sleeping with the first sergeant the first chance she get. So,
and just so we're clear, just because, you know, we don't want this conversation part to be misconstrued, because
right.
I will say that when I was in Iraq, I worked with a shit hot soldier, Cindy. She's the only person that ever outshot me on a rifle range. And I had to fire her, not because she wasn't a good soldier, because when shit hit the fan, she wouldn't shoot people. In her heart, she was the mother who had a kid at home, and she saw all those, you know, kids they threw at us. Like, oh, I got a baby that age. And then I had was a 88 Mike, so she was a truck driver, but I escorted her convoys for almost half my tour. And Wendy O'Neill, I'd have followed her to hell just to get a glass of water because she said so, because she was that good. And
Right.
that comes from somebody who was very proud that I wore the blue cord, right? Like, so
Right.
there are good females out there. It's not denigrating, but it's realistically that transition. And I was out when it happened, but I couldn't imagine there wasn't some hidebound resistance just because nobody likes change.
Yeah. And so, and I've served with some incredibly impressive women and men, obviously. So I didn't want this book to, be some sort of social commentary on anything. That's not what I'm trying to do. It's just, these are people, and I'm trying to make these people as realistic as I can. Because, I got the extremes, and then I've got everybody else in between.
Is this a Abrams in the background?
Yeah. So remember when I said this series was about logistics?
Yeah.
Look where they are.
Getting refueled.
Yeah, but look, scroll up.
Oh,
yeah. So they're scrounging for fuel.
Is Love's an actual gas station company?
Oh yes. I
Okay.
did not tell the artist to do this, so I hope Love's doesn't get mad at us. We all the respect in the world to Love's. Our artist is from the Philippines, and I guess he saw that as an American gas station and rolled with it. But
works for me.
No, but the idea is, this unit is siphoning fuel out of the tanks at a gas station, and they're surviving and scrounging just like everybody else.
It's the what do you call it? The dust cover's on the wrong side. If that's what it looks like, it almost looks like it's a dust cover on the other side. It should be.
Well, it's flipped down because she's been shooting.
No. I'm just saying it shouldn't be on the other side of the rifle. I'm trying to get the perspective right. It's been, yeah.
No, it's on the correct side.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and in the background, you can see zombies running at them, and the crews on the tanks while they're refueling are shooting into the zombie mob that's running at them.
It's hard sometimes when you talk about art, and this is the reason I am not an artist, to visualize what you're doing and then to try to flip it so when you're looking at an image, it mirrors right, because sometimes you can get it backwards if you're not careful. Yeah. And you can tell a good artist because they can visualize it and adjust for reality in a way that I cannot.
Yeah. Well, and again, I haven't been directly interfacing with the artist. My publisher has, and I gave him kind of a sketch and said, this is kind of my vision. And man, he'd knock it out of the park. And this one too, from the latest novel. This is from a scene in the book. Well, if you'll allow, I'll describe the scene. So they get to Denver, and so the 1st Infantry Division is been ordered to go to what's called the Cascadia Redoubt, which is where American forces and government is consolidating in a zombie-free zone up in Oregon and Washington State and whatnot. But these guys have to road march all the way from Kansas, which is like an unprecedented distance. So by book 3, they are in Denver, and they've been ordered to secure the Denver International Airport so that U.S. forces from abroad are being brought back home. But there's not enough surviving airports and Air Force bases and seaports to support this redeployment of, over 100, maybe 200,000 U.S. troops. So they have to get the Denver International Airport back up and running. So they go and they do that. But as they're going towards Denver, the 1st Infantry Division only keeps itself together because the division commander says, well, we're not abandoning our families, because who's going to fight for a unit if they got to leave their families behind, right? So you have 16,000 camp followers with the 1st Infantry Division. So not only does the division have to fight, but they got to protect 16,000 civilians and feed them and clothe them. You remember this logistics thing I was talking about?
A lot of fat Americans would be losing weight.
Yeah. And so they get there, but the problem is, people start becoming sick because some people are too lazy to go poop in the slit trenches.
Ooh.
And people are starting to get all those diseases, those GI diseases, gastrointestinal. And by the time they get to Denver, people are dying from these infections and these diseases, and they need antibiotics, and there isn't enough of it. So the division commander starts sending missions into Denver to the hospitals and the pharmacies to go start grabbing medicines because they simply don't have enough. And this scene is depicts at the end of one of the chapters where they're in a hospital, and then of course, what's hanging out in the hospital? Zombies. And what's hanging out in the neighborhoods around the hospitals? Zombies. And so they have a hot, things go sideways, hot extract, Army aviation has to get them out, and all these sorts of things are going on.
So first, Denver Airport. And now that we got the covers, we'll get back to just us. Denver Airport has a lot of conspiracy theories surrounding it.
Oh yes, that was not an accident. Why I picked that one.
Oh, okay. So you factor some of that into the plot elements?
Oh God, yes.
I only became aware of it because my friend sends me all the dankest memes that I steal. And so she sent me one about it because her and her husband are like meme, like farmers of the greatest degree. Most of the ones I have, I steal from her and her husband. And she was the one who told me about all the conspiracy theories. And I'm like, wait a minute. So when you mentioned the Denver airport.
So the idea came from my own brother, who flies for United Airlines, and he's like, okay. and he's hubbed out of Denver, and he's like, oh man, there's so many of these cool conspiracy theories. Here's a link, here's a link, here's a link, here's a link. I'm like, holy shit, I got to use this.
So one of the things that you maybe didn't account for, but people don't think about logistics. Well, as you don't have, lazy calories where you can sit around and do nothing and have high caloric food that, maybe we'd be better out without, like McDonald's and whatnot. You're going to lose a lot of weight pretty quickly at first. And then suddenly another logistical issue is nothing fits.
Oh, yeah.
And then everything that, everyone thinks people in the past were shorter or skinnier. And that's not so much that it was true. It's just because those were outliers, that's what survived, because they would wear clothes until they fall apart. You're going to run into that is there's not a lot of skinny people stuff on shelves because retailers are used to Americans being fat.
No.
So it'd be
people run out of razor blades. So in my books, they all start growing beards and get long hair because
Duck Dynasty style.
Well, yeah, because they don't have enough razor blades anymore. And
so you mentioned obviously that when you were the basic training battalion commander, you went back to the spirit of the bayonet, which makes me wonder, given the situation on the ground changing. When I went through both my combat deployments, we were not issued bayonets. All of us had like K-bars. Some of us had pilot's knives strapped to our flak jacket for whatever, but we didn't have bayonets.
Yep.
So is that something that your people brought back to keep distance, added that extra whatever to keep distance from the zombies, or do you not factor that in?
Oh, yeah. So, no, so 100%. So bayonets make a big comeback. But my boys and girls in my platoon in the book, they also acquire additional melee weapons because noise draws zombies, right? So when they go in to clear a house or a building, the first thing they do is they try to reduce noise signature. And zombies see like humans do. So they try to operate at night with night vision goggles and IR, and they try to take advantage of whatever they have. So their buddy teams are set up. One's primary is a firearm, the other is a melee weapon, like a sledgehammer or a machete or an axe or whatever they're most proficient with. But yeah, bayonets are big in my world. And so is mop gear, because if you get that shit in your eyes or your mouth or your nose, you turn.
Oh man, that was some of the most miserable hours of my life, sitting in that hazmat suit from hell. That's what mop gear is. Mission-oriented protective posture, people. It's the green suit you see in the pictures people are wearing.
Chemical suit.
It is miserable.
Gas masks. So, so they don't have enough of that stuff, right? So they're still relying on ballistic eyewear and cravats, like bandanas over to protect themselves mostly. But after after every close contact battle with the zombies, everybody has to go into quarantine. So they go through the quartermaster site where they strip off uniforms. They got to go to quartermaster showers. They get reissued new uniforms. Then they go into quarantine to be watched so they don't turn. If the vehicles are involved, they got to go to the chemical battalion where they do a deliberate decon, where they do the hoses and they decon like a chemical environment to get all that shit off the tanks and the Bradleys. It's all in the book. I try to make this as if the U.S. Army were to fight zombies, this is how I would envision them doing it.
The other thing that you got to factor in is the gas masks work because they're filters on the mask. That's what the round thing, if you've seen the image, people, that's on the outside, that little circular thing. Those are not indefinite. So that's another logistical issue because it's filled with charcoal. But at a certain point in time, you're going to end up going back to the World War I gas mask, which is essentially linen that you're pissing on.
Yeah, so the mop suits and the gas masks, like you said, are in short supply. So they only really break those out for cleanup operations where they're cleaning up dead zombie bodies. So they have to use those sparingly because after every use, they throw them in a pile and they burn that stuff.
So is this book first, because you mentioned listening to it or reading it, is this in audio yet? And will it be?
All of them are in audio. All three are an audio book.
Because I am curious, and I know with my TBI, like I do my listening I do my reading with my ears these days.
Yep.
And so I do have some credits to burn, so I'll have to check it out.
They're all on Audible right now.
Are they same narrator for all three?
I'm sorry?
Did you use the same narrator for all three?
Yes. 100%. Yeah. Talon Beeson, he's our narrator. He's a super talented actor. He's a card-carrying member of the Screen Actors Guild.
Cool.
He's a acting, professor at a university in Tennessee, I believe. And Talon's so awesome. And Talon, God, I can't say enough nice things about him. So Talon has been so collaborative throughout this whole process. So he'll like, hey, I've never been in the military before. How do you pronounce this acronym? Because, you'll say a tactical operations center is spelled TOC, right? And Talon will go, do I pronounce it TOC or is it talk? And you go, well, it's talk, like speaking. He's like, oh, okay, thank you. And he's so great about that stuff. He wants to get all the little details right because he knows that for folks like us who are military oriented and we're listening to this, if you get those little details wrong, it rips you right out of the experience. So he goes the extra mile to get it right. And he's been so good about reaching out with me. And of course, I've gone in and listened to all the chapters as he's recorded them and said, hey, Talon, you need to tweak this or you need to tweak. And he's been so cool about everything. God, I couldn't have asked for a better guy for the project.
And the hard part is you don't know what people don't know. So like when you listen, there's the old joke when Obama was president, when he said corpsman instead of corpsman. Right. Like, I know they ribbed him for it, but I don't fault him because if you're not growing up around that, that's how it's spelled. Right. But you saw that. To me, that's no different than Reagan's I'm a jelly donut, ich bin ein Berliner. I mean, it's the same kind of thing, right? Like, shit happens, but you don't think as a service person, because it's corpsman, obviously. You don't think those words that are easy. Another one is route versus route. They're spelled similar. A route is a very specific military endeavor, one I would hope to never experience. That is what happened after the first battle of the wilderness, for instance, where you just started running for the hills and hoping your friends were slower. So like, you get those words wrong and you don't even realize, oh shit, I should have told them that. So it's cool that he's proactive.
Yeah. So great actor, by the way.
So we can't talk about a zombie apocalypse novel without talking about your zombies. So are they the fast runners, the slow shamblers? Like, tell me about your zombies.
God, my zombies. So I got all of them, right? So the Z virus affects. So I base this off of like the COVID experience, right?
Okay.
So COVID manifested itself differently in everyone. So some people would lose their sense of taste and smell. Some people didn't have that experience at all. They just got tired. Some people had, trouble breathing. It based upon your own personal metabolism and your own defense system, you were able to deal with the disease differently. And the way the disease mutated itself would change and so forth. So in my books, the Z virus is very much like that. So some people, if they got bitten by a zombie, it was venomous and they would drop dead. They'd just die, right? They wouldn't turn. They're just dead. Some people would get bit and they would turn into a shambler. They'd just groaning, just dragging their feet, whatever. Some people were walkers. They could walk and, focus. Some were runners. They could sprint like Olympic sprinters. And those were a smaller percentage, right? As they, dealt with, the more deadly they were, the smaller the percentage of them, but they were nasty. But the top ones were what I call the alphas. And the alphas still retain some level of intelligence. And the alphas were about as intelligent as dogs or chimpanzees. And they could still speak a few words to each other. And they could understand and they could, problem solve. They could communicate. And so the alphas would hunt in packs. And these turned out to be the boogeymen of my universe, because people are always talking about the alphas, but nobody ever actually saw one, but they're out there, but they're real. And the alphas were smart enough to know that army people or people with guns were dangerous. They knew that intuitively. So the alphas would go for the easy ones. They would pick off people that weren't paying attention, people that were off, looking for water or whatever, the alphas would snatch them and, whatever. But the alphas were always very sly and slick, and they would think and they would use tactics and they would communicate. And these turn out to be the biggest problems for our heroes. And, they would see these armies of the undead, the shamblers and the walkers and the runners who were nasty. But the alphas were out there lurking, and those are the ones that would cause the most problems.
So as their body decomposes, does that change things? Do they stop decomposing? Because at a certain point in time, you just wait them out. They're all going to drop dead because the body won't be there.
Yeah. So their metabolism's kind of slow. The decomposition process progresses to a certain point. And it continues, but it slows down, and it all depends on how often they feed and are able to, their systems are able to regenerate themselves and whatnot.
So is their heart still pumping then? Because in some of them, if they're actually physically dead, then at a certain point in time, like their muscles are going to give, and now they're not going to be able to move. It really depends on the paradigm with the zombies, which is why I'm asking.
Yeah, so I don't get into the heart pumping stuff, but if you want to kill a zombie, you knock out the brain. And
okay.
So headshots are the way to go. And
which goes against, I remember the hundreds of thousands of hours training the Mozambique drill, where that's the last shot you make, not the first.
Well, and so that, again, I talk about that in the books too, because Army people aren't trained to go for headshots. And that's when most of your soldiers have a real problem dealing with zombies, because they aren't trained to hit headshots, and they're not trained to hit headshots on moving targets.
Right.
And so that is something that isn't addressed often. Like, you have hundreds of these things coming at you, but you got to be a pretty damn good shot to get a headshot, even on something that's moving slow. And, that's a problem.
And it takes longer to aim for those. So it's not like center mass where there's, it's easier to do. Right. That's where that famous scene in Mel Gibson's The Patriot, aim small, miss small. The idea is if you narrow your focus to a tighter target, even if you miss, you're closer to it than if you just generally aimed in the direction.
Yeah.
And that's shooting center mass, because that's what for those that don't know, that's what the Mozambique drill is. We call it giving them a dollar's worth, because when I was in, Army paid 22 cents a bullet. So double tap to the chest, one to the head to finish them off. So two to the chest, face gets the rest. It's where those memes come from. And I don't know how easy it would be to counter, like if you think about the man hours we spent training that.
Yeah, it's tough. But there's many scenes in my book where I talk about, soldiers, they're unable to deal with the zombies because especially runners. Like if somebody's sprinting at you and you're trying to get a headshot, how you get, that is not an easy thing to do.
So you also 2016, you'll still have some of those people because that would have been us. When I enlisted in the Army, we didn't have the flak jackets. We had the load-bearing vest, which was the suspender-looking thing over our BDUs. You were taught to aim both prone in a foxhole and then standing with a side profile because the idea was to give yourself a smaller target because you're harder to hit. Suddenly you add flak jackets with small arms protective insert SAPI plates. And now you're standing and firing chest facing forward because that's where your protection is. And even just that's why I had hundreds of thousands of hours, well, not thousands, but a shit ton of hours on the range because they had to break all those years of habits. And now you're doing it again with the marksmanship. I'm glad you factor that in because most people don't think like there's a reason you do so much repetitive training.
Yeah. Well, and that's something I address because that, and I talk about the change of tactics too. Because if you're fighting an enemy who also can think and has tanks and artillery and, all this stuff, you fight a certain way, but they evolve their tactics to deal with the zombie threat because the zombies are a very different thing. They come at you differently. And so
are they horde attack or are they solo or what?
Say how?
Are the zombies, do they do the horde attacks like you see in some, or is it?
They do totally horde attacks because they go. So some of them, they alert the others. Some will do a howl or a shriek or a call to alert the others that there's a feed. And then the others are drawn in. So yeah, it's always a mass attack whenever they're in close combat.
So I would imagine something like a bouncing Betty, some claymores that are raised height level. I mean, you could adjust because now you just project your explosives at the head.
Yeah. So my M1 tanks are really keen to use canister rounds.
Yeah, I was about to ask about that.
Yeah. So I've got a lot of tanks using canister, but I've also got a lot of tanks just using their treads because
crunchies. Yeah.
That's a really effective way to deal with infantry that is just kind of walking towards you.
So what we talk about logistics is resupply is a thing. Obviously, factories are probably not so cranking out new parts, et cetera. But everything old can be new again. So you mentioned canister shot, some of those old 5-pounders and all those old cannon pieces that are museum pieces, or we use them at ceremonies. If we can fire them ceremonially, we can aim them with real rounds. Do you start bringing some of that old stuff back?
I don't explore that, but in book 2, there is a massive battle in Kansas City at the National World War I Museum and Memorial.
So if they have to use
familiar with this place, you'll know why that's cool.
They got some Maxim guns there.
But that's not what gets brought into the play. But,
that's one of those things where essentially at a certain point in time, what's old is new again, because you can fire canisters and you don't even necessarily have to be able to produce the ball bearings for the canisters because those sometimes they just load them with rocks, grape shot, whatever.
Well, that sort of thing comes into book 3, where our civilians are kind of putting together ad hoc weapons. And they're making homemade claymore mines out of old coffee cans and nuts and bolts and broken glass. And
nice.
Yeah. So that all comes into play in book 3. Yeah, so.
I will say that I was pleasantly surprised that in Vermont this past year, so 2024, if you're listening later, there was actually a home invasion and the guy happened to have a flintlock rifle. So he did defend his home with a flintlock rifle against a modern invader. I was disappointed, however, to hear he did not yell tally ho when he fired at them.
Oh.
Missed opportunity.
Awesome. But yeah, tally ho would have been the cherry on top.
So speaking of, you mentioned the home forces. Earlier, you mentioned you like stories with mercenaries, which I find odd because most veterans I met actually kind of mercenaries that are doing it just for the money leave a distaste in their mouth. But militias don't, because that's generally, they're motivated by various things. So do you factor in militia units into this world now that you've got shit going on?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So, and National Guard. So the first book, one of the big friction points is the fact that the regular army is brought in. They don't know it's a zombie apocalypse yet. So there's this little thing called posse comitatus. I assume you're familiar with it.
I am.
So they're trying to secure Kansas City because it's a nexus, it's a hub, it's a big transportation hub in the center of the United States. It's where all the rail lines connect, the highway systems. That they got to keep this open to move military traffic. And they know, the zombie thing is coming. They're not told at the lower levels it's zombies, but the higher ups know. So with posse comitatus, the National Guard units, the Kansas boys and the Missouri boys, they all have bullets, but the active duty folks from 1st Infantry Division don't. So they might have tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, but they don't have ammunition when the zombie apocalypse breaks out. So that's one of the first things they wrestle with in book 1. Going into book 2, now Kansas and the governor of Kansas is like, well, I'm trying to defend the people of Kansas with my National Guard units, and you active duty people aren't really helping us. So be nice if you got the hell out of my state. And, there's a lot of friction between state and federal in both, all the books, frankly. So that comes into play. And then as our units are moving across country, yes, they do run into local militias and towns that are just trying to defend themselves and survive. Local farming communities in particular in the Midwest, just trying to make it through this thing because nobody's coming to help. So they're helping themselves. And have you seen the TV show Jericho back in the day?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that.
Yeah, I may make a reference to that. But yes, I talk about a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, that's one of the things that people, even modern soldiers don't necessarily think about. For me, it was my undergrad, I got a military history, was one of my focus for my history degree. And so you start to think about things differently when you realize that the totality of combat, there are options out there that maybe you don't think about, which allows you to be creative in your storytelling, I would imagine, because you would have had those same classes. If nothing else, ROTC teaches mil history.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, so once the body is shot, is there a reason that they're burning the dead zombies? Is it mostly to prevent spread of infection and disease?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
That's the reason. Yeah. So in book 3, they're clearing the Denver International Airport, and they're trying to clean that thing out so they can use it. So they're in mop suits cleaning, hauling out dead bodies and burning them, and then they're bringing in industrial chemicals and scrubbing the place down, and all that stuff, so they can use those facilities. There's talk about, well, why don't we just nuke these places? Well, yeah, that's easy to talk about, but this infrastructure is priceless. The electrical grids, the cell towers, the rail lines, the roads, all of it, the sewer systems, the water. Like, who's going to rebuild all of it if you nuke it? Like, you just can't destroy this shit. It's invaluable. So nobody wants to start popping nukes on the zombies in the initial days.
What about fire? How does that handle on zombies?
Oh, they don't like it. It turns out they sort of have this visceral aversion to fire, just like every other animal.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing you run into if you're talking post-apocalypse. So I realized that when I wrote a post-apoc short story. So for instance, the deserts that are out west, they become one major desert if you don't have the maintenance of the Hoover Dam and the resupply and stuff, because some of what is habitable now was made so by modern terraforming, essentially. And if you lose everything, like Las Vegas is a desert again.
Oh yeah.
You get grass and stuff starting to grow because people going there, drinking the water, then as they, void the water from their bodies, it gets into the ground system and it becomes part of the cycle of life, and you start adding moisture that wasn't there. You take away humans in large numbers and infrastructure, and that goes away. And then the Hoover Dam, if you don't have people maintaining it, that's just one massive desert that is essentially uninhabitable.
Yep.
And so it's interesting that you're factoring in all of that. Do you have people maintaining some of those reactors and the dams and stuff?
So they try to at first. So yes, they try to, and then things, as you can imagine, it's a cascading effect of failure.
Absolutely. Cascading failures is the way it normally goes. Does the zombie virus affect non-humans, so animals, zombie dogs, bears, that sort of thing?
So I don't really go into that, though. They what I do say is zombies will attack animals to feed on them, which is important because one of my main characters is a sheriff's deputy named Angie, and she's got a canine, German Shepherd named Saxon, and they're a pretty important part of the team because they end up getting civilians to start working with them in this platoon. I got a lot of civilians. I got a couple of illegal aliens, and I got
none of that matters now.
Right. And that's part of the book. Like, they can't speak English, and they're like, well, who gives a shit now? And I got a family, where the mom and the dad are, they're marathon runners, and they got their daughter with them, and he's a bank manager and all this stuff, but he ends up working with them. But they survived because they were physically fit marathon runners, and they could use guns, because so they could outrun zombies and shoot.
Do you factor in one of the plots in a lot of zombies is go somewhere cold because it slows them down and the zombies can't function? Is that apply to zombies in your world?
It will. Yeah. So you'll see in my series that they're trying to race winter. So the outbreak starts 4th of July weekend, and then they get these movement orders to go to Washington State, to Yakima. But they got to get through the Rocky Mountain passes before the first snow flies. And they have like 1,600 miles to move, which is, if you know anything about military history, that's an unprecedented move for a mechanized infantry unit. So by the time they're getting to Denver, well, let's just say it's October, and things are starting to look like the snow is going to beat them into the mountain passes.
Yikes.
And then it's all about logistics, right? Like, how are they going to survive winter without food? How are they going to make it? How without tents and heaters and, blah, 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 blah. That's the race. They're racing against Mother Nature. The zombies, yeah, they'll slow down, but maybe not completely. But we'll see.
So is this planned out as in, at some point they're going to either everyone dies or you find a cure because the situation as you described is not sustainable long term? And do you have like a plan for where that ends? Obviously, don't tell us. Just tell us if you have a plan.
No, I don't have a plan.
So you're going to let the muse take you where it takes you?
Yeah, right now, yeah.
So
I've just published book 3. I have an idea for book 4 that I think is going to be super cool. But yeah, I don't know where I'm going past book 4 yet.
How much of a factor does J.F. Holmes's books, The Irregulars, because you said that's in his world, as a shared world, right, how much does what he's doing affect what you're doing?
Well, see, I'm trying to be true to his. Well, he's canon publishing, so no pun intended. I'm trying to stay within his canon as best I can. So yeah, I'm trying to not to violate the rules of his universe. He, his stories are very, very different than mine. His storytelling, his voice, his muse, it's different than mine. So
no, obviously you're two different authors. That's to be expected. I meant more from a storytelling canonical perspective.
Oh no, I'm trying to stay on canon. I'm
so So do you have to coordinate with him when you do things?
Yeah. So I ask him often, hey man, I want to do this with a story, and this is my timeline. How does that? Because he wrote he wrote 11 books. Yeah. I'm full disclosure, I haven't read more than the first one. So I can't read 11 books. It's too much homework. So yeah, I got to ask him, and I don't want to stray outside of his canon because.
So his books are U.S. centric too, I believe. Do you plan collectively to go to other parts of the world where this is also happening?
Oh, that would be fun.
Could you imagine fighting them off in a castle?
Yeah, no, I hadn't thought about it. That would be fun. I spent 9 years in Korea. I would always love to write some fiction about some U.S. Army unit in Korea, in some weird situation like the zombie apocalypse.
And you forgive my ignorance, did Korea ever have castles that would give you kind of natural historic?
Oh yeah. There's tons of them.
Because that's what I'm thinking.
They're Asian style, of course, but
right. Because I'm just thinking, there's a reason we built those things the way we did.
Oh yeah,
they
built the shit out of some castles. I'm here to tell you, I've been to some of them. They're pretty cool.
Because some of that is going to give you, it's just the barrier need to pick off the baddies, right? So
yeah, you know what? It doesn't matter where in the world you were. Back in the old days, we all had tactics.
Yeah,
and the Asians had castles too.
I don't know what survived, what's there. I'm just, rather than speaking ignorance, I figured if you'd been there, you would know.
Yeah.
But I'm just picturing, some Scotsman in his kilt with a rifle on a castle wall, be like, "Come here, you laddies."
Oh God. You know why Koreans today are so keen on, using the bow and arrow in competitions? It goes back to that. The warfare stuff. They love archery.
So do you factor any of those kinds of weapons? Because there are going to be civilians with bow and arrow. Thinking back to Daryl on Walking Dead, with his crossbow, does that stuff come into play with your militias?
Yeah. So my books are pretty early on in the outbreak. So we're still pretty heavy on firearms, but
okay.
But like I said, my squad, my platoon, they've been reduced. They used to be a platoon. Now they're still called a platoon, but there's 8 of them left.
Attrition's a mother.
Yeah, it is a mother, but they got a lot of melee weapons.
Okay.
So yeah, that is, it is coming to that, right? But we're still only a couple of months into the zombie apocalypse.
But this is of an era where it says the GWAT is fading, assuming that you stood true to the American or to the timeline up into 2014. I remember as I was getting out in the push towards the keeping that warrior ethos, you were starting to see more infantry units where guys were carrying combat tomahawks, modern versions of them, and machetes as secondary weapons for close-in combat. So it would be unrealistic to have some of these guys have those.
No, and they do, and well, in our hero in the book, not to spoiler alert, our hero in the book starts off as an NCO fighting in Afghanistan, and then comes home and has an incident, and he's convicted of a crime he did not commit.
A-team!
Not the A-team, but he ends up going to Leavenworth to the disciplinary barracks, and he's out on a work release detail, cutting hair at the local barber shop on Fort Leavenworth when the zombie apocalypse breaks out. So, yes, I do try and keep the timelines. He starts off as fighting in Afghanistan and, all that stuff.
And that's an interesting thing that Walking Dead explored, is the idea of what happens to these prisons.
Mm.
And I don't know that I was comfortable with the approach they took, because it I don't know. It didn't feel like they thought of all the the variables. But it sounds like that could be something that could come into play. Is what do you do with all those prisoners that are sitting in Leavenworth?
Well, in my case, they all starved to death probably behind bars. My guy was out on a work release program and got lucky.
Yeah.
Because what's going to happen? They're all going to be locked up.
You see some of that with Hurricane Katrina and the prisoners that were abandoned in jails that flooded, which is unfortunate, obviously. But I mean, reality is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, what's going to happen to them? They're going to die.
And some of those people are there for a reason. And do you necessarily want them running amok when society's breaking down?
Yeah, well, all I can say to that is if it happens, they're probably all going to die.
Okay. All right. Was there anything, because, we've been at it for 2 hours, and as much as I'm having fun, I'm
having a blast. Me too.
If we get too long, they're just not going to listen. So is there anything before we wrap this up about the thin deadline that we didn't talk about that you think they need to know?
If you like zombie stuff, this is for you. If you like horror stuff, this is for you. If you like military adventure stuff, this is for you. If you just like good character stuff, this is for you. I think this series, I think why it's been successful is it crosses so many genres. There's something there for everybody. And I honestly think that's why there's such an interest. I recently just had a new fan reach out to me and say, "Hey, I never read fiction. I saw this thing. I read your book. I really love it, and I'm going to read the rest of them." And that's such high praise, and I'm so touched by that kind of thing. But there's so many different genres it touches on. There's probably something in there for you, except if you're into romance. I'm sorry, this is not a romance novel.
Those zombies need love too,
They do. But I can tell you, there's probably something in the series that you might be interested in.
Speaking of people being interested in, we talked about this in the pre-show, and I didn't want to forget this, but can you tell us about the award you were nominated for?
Oh, yeah, snaps. So the second book in the series, Dead Storm Rising, is a finalist in the Dragon Award competition in the best horror novel category. So I would encourage everybody, if you could, please vote for me for best horror novel. That would be awesome. We have until the 31st of August to vote. I've never been nominated for one of these things before. I've never been a finalist. If I won, I would be super stoked and super appreciative. So if you're not familiar with the Dragon Award or my books, please give it a look. I would love it, and I'd really appreciate it.
So the registration link and a wiki explaining what it is will be in the show notes. Basically, you sign up your email. You have to vote before August 31st. This will be airing on the 16th of August. So you have 2 weeks after this airs to go and vote if this is your jam. And it is in there as an option. And then obviously, if you win, take a lot of pictures and show everybody the cool little award, put it on your bookshelf.
100%.
So,
because I won't be able to do it without you. So it's our award if we win it.
And if you win, you have to say something nice to your wife because she motivated you to do the writing. So, just so you don't have to sleep on the couch.
Well, she'll be there at the ceremony. Win, lose, or draw, she'll be there side by side with me. So it's all good.
That's the way it's supposed to be. All right. So if people want to stalk you, follow you on the internet, where can they find you?
So I'm on Facebook mostly. And I have a Facebook group. So I have a Facebook group called Shane's Rally Point. So check me out. So and I think you're going to put up a link to that, perhaps?
Absolutely. All of that will be in the show notes.
Yeah. And you can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Instagram. I'm out there. So shoot me a note. I'm loving to hear from everyone.
And if you're doubting or curious about the Shane rally point, I will tell you that some of my memes that I share on my personal page on Facebook, because that's pretty much what I do on my social media, because, why get political? I'm never going to convince anybody shouting at the internet. So I just share memes. And my rule of thumb is always, did I laugh? I don't care if it's left, right, or center. If I laughed, it goes. Some of the memes that I steal come from his Facebook group, and then they go on our Twitter page. So if you think they're funny,
they're amazing. They're amazing.
You can get them before I do. And then I'll farm from you instead. This is the way.
Yeah.
Internet memes are not shared; they are stolen. It is the way.
Please stop on by. Check us out.
So all of that will be in the show notes. You can check it out, dear listener. Give them a follow. You can find us on our Linktree, linktr.ee/Blasters and Blades podcast, Linktree/Blasters and Blades podcast, where we link to all the things: the BitChutes, the Rumbles, the YouTubes, the TikToks, the Twitters. We have our Blasters and Blades podcast Facebook group and Facebook page. We have our email, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com. Again, blastersandbladespodcast@gmail.com for professional purposes only, people. We have, more importantly, Madam Stabby Stab over on the Instagram, Twitter, and the email for all the shenanigans. Send them her way. We have our website over on Spotify, which is easier just to go to the Linktree, linktr.ee/Blasters and Blades podcast, where you can find our website. And for as little as 99 cents a month, you can help keep the lights on. These episodes are not free to produce. We spend about $400 a year on our overhead, and every penny you throw our way makes a difference, and we greatly appreciate it. Or you could support us more directly by going to buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Again, buymeacoffee.com/author J.R. Handley. Be sure to put in the comment section that is for the podcast, and I promise I will keep my co-hosts duly caffeinated. They will drink that coffee brand coffee till it pours out of their nostrils, because we haven't done that orifice yet. And speaking of, if you want to help us out, link is in the show notes. Code is Podcast Grunt over at Coffee Brand Coffee. You get 10% off. We get a kickback. It's a win-win, and you get delicious coffee from a company that isn't a drop shipping company. They roast and make their own products here in the U.S., hiring American workers. So you are helping your local economy, and I am all about supporting and shopping local over the international conglomerates. So if that's important to you, check out Coffee Brand Coffee. The coffee's delicious. I'm addicted. Stabby's addicted. Nick just foots the bill. We are probably our own number one customer in the Coffee Brand Coffee rebates that we get. They say don't use your own supply, but we didn't listen to that lesson on marketing. So, what are you going to do? And with that, we'd like to thank you for spending some of your precious time with us. For my crazy co-host, I am J.R. Handley, and this was the Blasters and Blades podcast. We'll be back next week at the same time, where we'll indulge our love of nerd culture, cheesy jokes, and all things that go boom. Thank you for coming on, Shane. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks.
And hopefully we can have you back in September, and you can tell us all about your winning podcast or your winning novel.
Oh, God, I hope so.
Fingers crossed. Now I'll have to go register and vote. I wasn't going to this year, but now I have to.
Oh, gosh. Please do. Please do.
I took out the category that was most important to me, and it just started getting stupid. And I'm like, you know what? I really don't care about these awards. So, yeah. But when I see my friends on there, I have to go vote.
Please do.
All right. And with that, I'm going to hit the end button, and we will talk to you later, dear listener.